The last time you completely lost it, the situation didn't actually require losing it. You just hadn't built anything better. That's not an insult. That's the whole book. Here's what nobody tells you about calm people. They're not wired differently. They're not meditating at 4 a.m. or journaling their feelings into a leather notebook. They built something, internal architecture that holds its shape when pressure gets applied. And then they used it. Repeatedly, until it stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like personality. Meanwhile, most people are walking around with the emotional infrastructure of a paper house and wondering why every storm feels catastrophic. Your brain has an ancient alarm system, the amygdala, that has been keeping humans alive since the days when the threats were actual predators. The problem is, it never got the update. It genuinely cannot tell the difference between a charging lion and a passive-aggressive email from your manager. Same chemical flood, same tunnel vision, same temporary suspension of your actual intelligence, which means every time something stressful happens, your body prepares you to either fight, flee, or stand very still and hope it doesn't notice you, none of which are particularly useful in a performance review. This is not a book about breathing exercises, though there are some. It's not a book about positive thinking, though perspective matters. It's a book about building the thing most people never build. A reliable internal system that keeps you functional when the conditions outside you are not. 21 techniques. Real ones. The kind used by surgeons, trial lawyers, crisis counselors, and anyone else whose profession punishes emotional reactivity immediately and visibly. You don't need all 21. You need the right 5, but you need to understand all of them to know which 5 are yours. One more thing before we start. Understanding these techniques won't change anything. Reading them won't change anything. The only version of this book that works is the one you actually use. Imperfectly, repeatedly, starting before you're ready. Your nervous system is not your enemy. It's just been running unsupervised for a long time. That ends here. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Not Losing It. You have approximately 5 seconds between the moment stress arrives and the moment it takes over your thinking. 5 seconds. Most people spend that window doing nothing, and then spend the next 20 minutes doing damage control. This chapter is about those 5 seconds. Not because 5 seconds sounds dramatic, because 5 seconds is actually enough time to change the entire outcome of a situation, if you've built something to use inside them. If you haven't, those 5 seconds are just the quiet before the wreckage. Here's what's happening in your body during a stress response. Blood flow redirects away from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for judgment, nuance, and not saying the thing you'll regret tomorrow, toward your limbs, so you can physically fight or run. Your thinking gets genuinely stupider, not metaphorically, measurably. The parts of your brain that make you good at your job, good in relationships, good at being a functional adult, they go partially offline. And the part that screams danger, react now, takes the wheel. The entire goal of this chapter is to teach you how to interrupt that process before it finishes. There are 2 tools for this. One is reactive. You use it when stress arrives unexpectedly. One is proactive. You use it before you walk into situations you already know are going to require you to be your best self. Together, they cover almost everything. The reset breath. The reactive tool is simple enough that your ego will resist it. One breath. That's it. The moment you feel tension arriving, and I mean the very first signal, not after it's already built into something structural, you breathe in through your nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale through your mouth for 6. The whole thing takes 10 seconds. Here's why the exhale matters more than the inhale. A longer exhale activates your parasympathetic nervous system, your body's actual off switch for the stress response. You're not just taking a breath, you're biochemically interrupting a process that, left alone, would have degraded your thinking for the next several minutes. The key word in that last paragraph is interrupting. You're not eliminating the stress. You're creating just enough space between stimulus and response that your brain can participate in what happens next. Most people wait until they're already overwhelmed to try calming down. That's like waiting until the car is skidding to decide you should have left earlier. The reset breath works because it catches the emotion early, before momentum, before the chemicals fully flood, before you've already said the thing. I used to think the people who seemed composed under pressure were just constitutionally different, slower to heat up somehow. Then I watched a close friend of mine, someone who once threw a phone across a room because his internet was slow, become someone who handles genuinely difficult situations without visibly cracking. I asked him what changed. He said, "I started catching it earlier." That was the whole answer. Not personality, not therapy, though therapy helped. The catch point. Your jaw is probably tight right now, by the way. Check. Most people carry chronic tension in their jaw, their shoulders, and their hands, and treat it as background noise rather than information. That tension is your body's early warning system. It's sending you a signal before the emotion has fully arrived. If you learn to read it, you get more than 5 seconds. You get 10, maybe 15. Enough time to actually choose. Practice the reset breath during low-stakes moments. The red light, the slow website, the coffee order that came out wrong. You're not calming yourself down from genuine threats. You're training your nervous system to associate that breathing pattern with a composed state. So when a real moment arrives, the response is already familiar, already grooved. This is not relaxation. This is architecture. The Power Pause Protocol. The proactive tool requires 30 seconds. That's it. 30 seconds before you walk into the conversation, the meeting, the interaction you already know is going to test you. Most people walk straight into difficult situations without any preparation whatsoever, and then are surprised when they perform worse than they'd like. You wouldn't walk into a championship game without warming up. You wouldn't take a major exam without reviewing your notes. But somehow, the hardest interpersonal moments of your life get zero preparation time because you told yourself you'd figure it out once you were in it. You don't figure it out once you're in it. You react, and you already know what that looks like. Here's the protocol. 30 seconds. 4 components. First, visualize success. Not vaguely, not in the generic positive thinking way, where you picture yourself smiling and everything being fine. Specifically, see yourself listening without getting defensive. See yourself speaking at half the speed you normally would when you're nervous. See yourself walking away afterward feeling like you were the adult in the room. Second, identify your actual goal, not what you want to say, what you want to achieve. These are almost never the same thing. What you want to say is usually the version that makes you feel temporarily better, at the cost of the outcome you actually need. What you want to achieve, a solution, a maintained relationship, a fair result, that's what guides a composed response. Third, set your body. Stand straight. Roll your shoulders back. Unclench your jaw. Take 3 slow breaths. Your posture is not just a reflection of your mental state. It actively creates it. Research consistently shows that adopting a confident physical posture changes your hormonal chemistry within minutes. Testosterone up, cortisol down. You're not performing confidence. You're manufacturing it from the outside in. Fourth, choose your identity. Decide in advance who you're going to be in this interaction. This sounds abstract until you realize what the alternative is, which is letting the situation decide for you. The situation, left to its own devices, will make you whoever you were the last time something similar happened. The power pause lets you choose differently. A lawyer I know does this in his car before every significant negotiation. Same parking lot, same 30 seconds, every time. He told me the negotiations he walks into prepared are categorically different from the ones he rushes into. Not because anything external changed, because he changed in advance, on purpose. The places to use this are more numerous than you think. Before a hard conversation with a partner. Before calling someone you know is going to push every button you have. Before family gatherings that have a documented history of going sideways by the second drink. Before any moment where your composure is genuinely load-bearing. The power pause protocol is about arriving already calibrated, instead of hoping you'll somehow find your footing inside the chaos. What these 2 tools share. Both of these techniques are operating on the same principle. The stress response is not instant. It has a sequence, and that sequence can be interrupted. The reset breath catches it at the beginning of the sequence. The first signal, the jaw tension, the heat in the chest. The power pause catches it even earlier, before the sequence has a reason to start at all. Together, they close almost every gap. The unexpected stress and the anticipated stress. The ambush and the scheduled difficulty. You're not hoping to stay calm. You're engineering the conditions under which calm is the most likely outcome. Here's what I've noticed after genuinely working on this. The techniques feel mechanical at first. Self-conscious. Like you're performing composure rather than having it. That feeling doesn't mean they're not working. It means you're early. The mechanical stage is the building stage. The self-consciousness is what learning feels like before it becomes instinct. The goal is not to feel calm in the moment you use these tools. The goal is to use them enough times that your nervous system stops needing to be told. Your nervous system is a dog that can be trained. Right now, it's running the house. It eats when it wants, barks when it wants, and knocks things over with its tail and looks genuinely confused at the damage. You've been living with that dog for years and calling it your personality. It isn't. It's just undertrained. You've been walking into fires your whole life without equipment and calling it bravery. It's not bravery. It's just wet wood. Chapter 2. The story your brain wrote without you. Your brain assigned a meaning to what just happened before you finished perceiving it. That meaning is probably wrong, and it is almost certainly making your life harder than it needs to be. This isn't a criticism of your intelligence. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, making fast predictions to keep you safe. The problem is that the prediction engine runs on pattern recognition, and your patterns were largely installed during periods of your life when you were younger, less resourced, and considerably more frightened. The patterns kept you alive. They are not, however, optimized for accuracy. The result is a brain that is an excellent writer of tragedy. Unfortunately, it's working on your autobiography. Here's the mechanism. Something happens. A critical email, a short response from someone you care about, an unexpected silence where you expected warmth. Your brain doesn't wait for evidence. It immediately generates an interpretation, and that interpretation triggers an emotional response. And that emotional response feels so real, so physically present, that you forget it was constructed. You treat it as fact. Two people receive the same critical feedback from the same manager, in the same words, in the same tone. One of them spends the afternoon convinced they're about to be fired. They replay the conversation on loop. They catastrophize. They draft responses in their head. They go home depleted and sharp-edged with everyone they love. The other one makes a note of what to work on and has a normal afternoon. Same event. Different story. Different nervous system. Different life. The gap between those two people is not intelligence or resilience or some personality trait distributed unevenly at birth. It's the story they told themselves about what the feedback meant. One brain wrote a thriller, the other wrote a memo. You are writing stories constantly. All day, every day. The only question is whether you're doing it consciously or letting the old patterns do it for you. The perspective flip. When something happens that would normally send you into a reaction, you pause, using your reset breath if you need it, and you run 3 questions before you accept your first interpretation as reality. The first question: how could this actually be helping me in a way I can't see yet? This is not toxic positivity. You're not pretending the thing that happened was secretly great. You're forcing your brain to scan for information it would otherwise ignore, because your brain, under stress, has a confirmation bias toward threat. It finds evidence that things are bad and filters out evidence that things might be fine. The first question disrupts that filter. Maybe the criticism is pointing at something real. Maybe the rejection protected you from something worse. Maybe the delay is giving you time you actually needed. You don't have to believe the optimistic version. You just have to entertain it long enough for your brain to stop treating the worst version as settled fact. The second question: what would someone I deeply respect think about this situation? This is the fastest way I know to access better thinking when your own thinking has been compromised by emotion. Your mentor. The author whose work changed how you see things. Your future self, looking back on this moment from 10 years out. Pick someone whose judgment you trust more than your scared brain's first draft, and borrow their perspective for 60 seconds. This works because it forces cognitive distance. You step outside the emotional reaction and consider the situation from a vantage point that isn't soaking in stress chemicals. Almost always, the view from there is less catastrophic. I've used this more times than I can count. Received feedback on something I'd worked hard on that landed like a verdict. First reaction: defensive, embarrassed, already writing the rebuttal in my head. Second reaction, after running the question: what would someone I respect actually think about this? They'd probably say one piece of critical feedback among several positive ones is not a referendum on my competence. They'd remind me that everyone who makes things gets criticized, and the criticism is often the most useful information in the room. The emotional charge dropped by about 60% in under 2 minutes. Same feedback, different story. The third question: How much will this matter in 5 years? This one functions as an eraser, not a comfort. It's not telling you that things don't matter. It's asking you to verify that the level of distress you're generating is proportional to the actual stakes. Because often, it isn't. Most things that feel career-ending today will not be remembered in 5 years. Most social embarrassments that feel permanent are forgotten by the people who witnessed them within 48 hours. Most conflicts that seem like they're going to permanently damage a relationship resolve, or don't, and life continues. The 5-year question doesn't trivialize, it calibrates. The deeper problem. Here's the thing most people miss about their own interpretations. They don't feel like interpretations. They feel like observations. They feel like you're simply reporting what happened. My boss doesn't respect me. My partner doesn't appreciate me. This situation is proof that things always go wrong for me. When what you're actually doing is running those facts through a meaning-making machine that was last serviced sometime during your childhood. The machine is not broken. It's just running old software. And old software, in new situations, generates errors. The perspective flip doesn't ask you to pretend the software is fine. It asks you to run a manual override, just long enough to check whether the interpretation your brain handed you is actually supported by evidence, or whether it's just a pattern completing itself. Because that's what patterns do. You are not obligated to believe the first story your brain writes. You are, in fact, the editor. You have always been the editor. Most people just never claimed the job. The cost of letting the machine run unattended is not small. It's the hard conversation you didn't have because your brain told you it would go badly. The opportunity you didn't take because your brain wrote the rejection in advance. The relationship you held at arm's length because your brain filed the other person under a category from a decade ago. All of it generated by stories, most of them never verified. Your brain is an excellent writer of tragedy. It has range, it has detail, it has a gift for stakes and urgency and the particular weight of impending doom. Unfortunately, it's been working on your autobiography. You're allowed to take the pen back. Chapter 3. Naming the thing that's eating you. There is a study, real, reproducible, cited in more psychology papers than I can count, showing that simply labeling an emotion reduces its intensity by a measurable amount. Naming what you feel, specifically and consciously, activates your prefrontal cortex and partially quiets your amygdala. Your rational brain walks back into the room the moment you give the feeling a name. Most people never do this. They feel a strong emotion and they become it. They don't say, "I'm noticing anger." They say, "I am angry," and then act accordingly, which usually means acting in ways they'll be explaining to someone later. The difference between those two sentences is not semantic. It's structural. "I am angry" means you and the emotion are the same thing. There's no gap, no observer, no one in the room capable of making a decision. Just the anger, wearing your face, sending emails. "I'm noticing anger" means you exist separately from the emotion. You're the one observing it. And observers can make choices that people who have become their feelings simply cannot access. This is the whole game. The emotion label system. 3 steps. Each one does something specific. Together, they transform your relationship with emotion from something that happens to you into something you can actually work with. Step 1. Name it. The moment a strong emotion arrives, you identify it specifically and say it, silently or quietly if you're alone. "I'm noticing anger. I'm noticing anxiety. I'm noticing shame." Not "I am." I'm noticing vague labeling doesn't work. I feel bad helps approximately nothing. The specificity is what activates the neural mechanism. Frustration is different from anger. Anxiety is different from dread. Embarrassment is different from shame. Get specific. The brain responds to precision. Step 2. Rate it. Give the emotion a number, 1 to 10. This step does two things simultaneously. First, it forces your rational brain to engage. You can't assign a number without thinking, and thinking is exactly what stress is trying to prevent. Second, it gives you perspective on proportion. Most things that feel like a 10 are, on honest examination, a 6, and a 6 is workable. A 6 you can function through. The rating also makes change visible. If you catch an emotion at a 4, use your reset breath, and it drops to a 2. That's evidence. Evidence your brain will use to trust the technique next time. You're building a track record with yourself. Step 3. Ask what it's telling you. This is where most people's relationship with emotion goes wrong. They treat emotions as problems to eliminate, something to push through or push down or apologize for. The idea that emotions are information, that they're data worth reading before dismissing, is genuinely foreign to most adults, because nobody taught it. Anger almost always means a boundary has been crossed, or something you value is being threatened. Not always legitimately. Sometimes your anger is pointing at an old wound rather than a current injustice. But it's always pointing at something. Anxiety usually means either you're facing genuine uncertainty that requires preparation, or you're confronting something that matters to you. Fear is frequently your nervous system's assessment that the next thing requires more of you than you've currently budgeted. None of these are problems to fix. They're signals to read. The difference is not small. When you treat emotion as a problem, you either suppress it, which doesn't eliminate it, it just relocates it, or you're overwhelmed by it. When you treat it as data, you extract the information, make a decision about how to respond, and move forward with agency rather than reaction. Someone I know had panic attacks before presentations. Full body, can't breathe, physically need to leave the room panic attacks. She'd been treating the anxiety as evidence that something was wrong with her, that her body was broken, that she couldn't handle pressure, that the feeling meant she was about to fail. When she learned this system, the shift wasn't dramatic at first. She still felt anxious, but she started running the 3 steps instead of fighting the feeling. I'm noticing anxiety. It's about a 7. My body is preparing for a performance. It's activating, not collapsing. The rating dropped from 7 to 4 within minutes. Not because the anxiety disappeared, because she stopped adding the second layer of panic on top of it. The panic about the panic was eating more of her than the original feeling. At 4, she could function. At 7, she couldn't. The emotion didn't change. Her relationship to it did. What you're actually doing here. The emotion label system is teaching you to be a witness to your own internal experience, which sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the hardest skills a human being can develop. Most people are so merged with their emotional states that the idea of observing them from any distance feels foreign. When you're inside the feeling, you don't perceive yourself as someone who has an emotion. You perceive yourself as someone who is in a situation that justifies the emotion. And those are two very different places to be standing. Standing inside the emotion. You're reactive, you're certain, you're building a case. Everyone else is wrong or oblivious or attacking you. The emotion is evidence of external reality. Standing outside the emotion, You're curious, you're provisional, you're asking questions. What is this telling me? Is it proportional? What do I actually want to do here? This isn't emotional detachment. It's emotional precision. You're not becoming colder. You're becoming more accurate. There's also a secondary benefit nobody talks about enough. When you develop the habit of naming and observing your own emotions, you get dramatically better at reading other people's. You start to recognize anger as fear that ran out of other options. You start to notice the specific texture of someone who is overwhelmed but performing fine. You stop taking things personally that were never about you. Your social intelligence sharpens almost as a side effect of your internal clarity. Because you stopped being confused about what's happening inside you, you have processing capacity left over for what's happening around you. You've been getting soaked for years. Turns out the umbrella was just knowing what kind of rain it was. Chapter 4. The body knows before you do. Your body knew you were stressed before your brain had finished forming the thought. That's not a metaphor. Your nervous system processes threat signals and initiates a stress response faster than conscious awareness can catch up. By the time you think this situation is stressful, your heart rate has already changed, your jaw has already tightened, your breathing has already gotten shallower. The body moved first. Your conscious experience of the emotion is, neurologically speaking, late to the party. Which means your body is also where the intervention lives. Most people treat the body as a passive recipient of mental states. Mind gets stressed, body gets tense. Mind calms down, body relaxes. The relationship goes one direction. But the science is clear that it moves both ways, and the body-to-mind direction is faster and more reliable than most people ever bother to use. You can change your mental state through your body, deliberately, consistently, without needing to think your way into a different mood first. This chapter is about building two tools that exploit that bi-directional relationship. One addresses your breath. One addresses your physical presence in space. Together, they give you access to a calm state even when your mind is already 3 steps ahead into the catastrophe. The breathing anchor box breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold empty. You've probably heard of it. You've probably tried it once during a stressful moment, found it mildly helpful, and then forgotten about it. Here's what you missed. The technique doesn't live in the moment you use it. It lives in the practice. Box breathing works because it creates a specific physiological state, synchronized heart rate, optimal brain oxygenation, activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. But it only works as an emergency tool if your nervous system already has that state on file. If you've practiced the pattern enough times during calm moments, your body recognizes it. It knows where that breathing pattern leads. When you use it under pressure, you're not introducing something new. You're accessing something already familiar, established, grooved. Think of it as muscle memory. A basketball player doesn't learn free throws during the championship game. They've made thousands of them in empty gyms at 7 in the morning, so that when the game is on the line, the body already knows. You're doing the same thing with your nervous system. 2 minutes every morning before you look at your phone. That's the entire commitment. Set a timer. Sit somewhere with reasonable posture. Close your eyes if you want. Just run the pattern for 2 minutes. In 4, hold 4, out 4, hold 4, and let your body learn the route. After 2 weeks of daily practice, something changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the breathing pattern becomes an anchor. When stress arrives during your day and you run 3 cycles of box breathing, your nervous system responds like it's been here before, because it has. This is why people who try this technique once in a crisis report it doesn't work, and people who practice it daily report it almost always works. The technique is the same. The preparation is entirely different. I want to be honest about what this does and doesn't do. It doesn't eliminate stress. It creates enough physiological space that your thinking can participate in what happens next. That's it. That's the whole value. You're not chasing a transcendent calm. You're creating a 2-second buffer between the stress signal and your response. A buffer that, without practice, doesn't exist. 2 seconds is, it turns out, enough. The physical ground. When anxiety starts to build, your attention narrows. This is by evolutionary design. Threats require focus, and your brain helpfully eliminates peripheral information so you can concentrate on the danger. The problem is that in most modern stress situations, the narrowing of attention makes things worse, not better. You stop seeing options. You stop perceiving nuance. You stop noticing that you're safe. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique reverses this by forcing your attention into present tense sensory reality. Anxiety, structurally, requires you to be in the future. It needs you projecting forward into what might happen, what could go wrong, how bad it could get. It cannot survive full contact with the immediate present. 5 things you can see, not glancing, actually looking. The texture of the wall, the way light falls across the desk, the specific shape of shadows. 4 things you can physically touch, the weight of the chair supporting you, the specific sensation of fabric against your skin, the temperature of the surface under your hand. 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. 60 seconds, sometimes less. What's happening is not relaxation, it's relocation. You're moving your attention from a future that exists only in your head to a present that is actually happening. And in the present that is actually happening, you are, in almost every case, physically safe. The threat is usually conceptual, a situation, a conversation, a decision, not something with teeth. Your body doesn't fully know that until you make it pay attention. The second part of this chapter's tool is one people find either obvious or slightly ridiculous, depending on their relationship with vulnerability. Power posture. Your physical position in space changes your hormonal chemistry. This is established, replicated research. When you make yourself small, shoulders forward, spine curved, taking up minimal space, you increase cortisol and decrease testosterone. Your body interprets the posture as a signal. Low status, threat present, prepare for subordination. When you stand straight, shoulders back, feet planted shoulder width, and take up your actual space, your body reads it differently. Cortisol drops, testosterone rises. The chemistry associated with confidence and capability shifts measurably within 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Before a presentation, before a difficult conversation, before any situation where you need access to your own competence, you don't need an audience for this. A bathroom stall works. A parking garage works. The back of an elevator, 2 floors before you walk into the room that matters. It feels slightly absurd at first. Good. The slight absurdity means you're doing something your old patterns didn't include. That's precisely where the work is. Someone I know in tech sales did this before every major client presentation for a year. Arms raised, feet planted, 2 full minutes every time, in the bathroom before walking into the conference room. She told me it felt ridiculous for about 3 weeks. Then it just felt like part of what she did. Her hands stopped shaking. Her voice stopped climbing in pitch when she got nervous. Her thinking during presentations became more available to her. Same person, same presentations, different body before she walked in. Here's what all of this points to. Your body is not a vehicle for your mind. It's a co-author of your mental state, constantly sending signals upward that shape how you think, how you feel, and how much of yourself you have access to. Most people spend enormous energy trying to think their way into better states, never once considering that they could stand their way there, or breathe their way there, in a fraction of the time. Your nervous system is not broken. It's not working against you. It's been incredibly responsive, actually, to every signal you've given it, including years of untrained ones. The good news is that it's just as responsive to the trained signals. It learns fast. It adapts readily. It just needed someone to actually start teaching it. Your nervous system is not broken. It's just been badly managed by someone who thought willpower was a substitute for design. Design it better. Starting with 2 minutes of breathing before you pick up your phone tomorrow morning. Chapter 5. Running the disaster in advance. Most people avoid imagining the worst because they believe imagining it will somehow summon it. This is magical thinking dressed in protective clothing, and it is costing you, specifically, a significant amount of unnecessary anxiety every single week. Here's the actual mechanism. The fear doesn't live in the worst-case scenario. The fear lives in the unexamined space around it. The vague, formless sense that something could go terribly wrong and you would be helpless. That formlessness is what makes anxiety so exhausting. You can't prepare for a fog. You can only prepare for a specific shape. Give the fear a shape, and it immediately becomes smaller. Not because the risk disappeared, because helplessness did. There are 2 tools in this chapter. One uses imagination to pre-train your nervous system for success. The other uses logic to demolish the power of vague, catastrophic thinking. They work differently, but they're solving the same problem: the gap between what might happen and your confidence that you could handle it. The future rehearsal. Your brain does not cleanly distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. This is not a motivational poster claim. It's measurable neuroscience. When you imagine performing an action with sufficient sensory detail, the sounds, the physical sensations, the specific texture of the environment, many of the same neural pathways fire as when you actually perform it. Which means your brain can accumulate experience in a situation you haven't lived yet. Elite athletes have known this for decades. Surgeons use it. Military pilots use it. Trial lawyers use it. The application is always the same. Mentally rehearse the performance in enough detail that when the real moment arrives, your nervous system has been there before. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The high stakes becomes, if not routine, at least navigable. Here's how to do it in a way that actually works. Because most people's attempts at visualization are too vague to generate the neural response that makes this technique valuable. First, identify what specifically tends to challenge your composure. Public speaking, confrontational conversations, receiving criticism, dealing with someone who operates on a different emotional register than you'd prefer. Make the list honest rather than flattering. Second, build the mental rehearsal with real sensory detail. Don't picture yourself generally doing well. Picture the room, the specific faces, the sound of your own voice coming out steady when you'd expected it to shake, the physical sensation of your shoulders staying relaxed, even as the situation gets harder. The moment someone pushes back, and you respond thoughtfully rather than defensively. This is where most people's visualization breaks down. They rehearse a frictionless version of events, which is essentially useless preparation. Life doesn't give you the frictionless version. Life gives you the version where the technology fails, or the person gets more aggressive than you anticipated, or something unexpected lands, and you have to adapt midstream. Rehearse the obstacles. Visualize the complication arriving, and then watch yourself handling it. Not magically, not perfectly, but competently, steadily, with the specific tools you've been building. Because your brain needs to practice recovery as much as it needs to practice performance. Third, repeat consistently over time. One visualization session does something. 20 creates a neural pathway that your brain treats as established experience. The goal is repetition, 5 to 10 minutes each evening, running the situations you know you'll face. Someone I know went from canceling presentations out of pure dread to genuinely preferring high-stakes ones. The change took about 3 weeks of nightly rehearsal. He told me the first few sessions felt almost embarrassing. Sitting there picturing himself walking onto a stage, hearing his own imagined voice, feeling faintly ridiculous. By week 2, it felt normal. By week 3, something had shifted. Walking into the real presentation, his body behaved like it had been there before, because neurologically, it had. The worst-case strategy. The second tool is for when anxiety is already present and doing its characteristic work of expanding indefinitely in every direction. 3 questions, in sequence. You don't skip to the third one. Question 1. What is the absolute worst realistic outcome? Not the catastrophic, impossible nightmare. The actual worst case. Specific, bounded, real. Most people never do this step because they're afraid that looking directly at the worst case will make it more likely or more devastating. The opposite is true. Vague dread is always worse than a named, specific fear. The moment you articulate exactly what you're afraid of, it loses the ambient expansion that makes anxiety so exhausting. Question 2. If that happened, what would you actually do? This is the question that dismantles helplessness. You're not hoping the worst case won't happen. You're building a concrete response plan for if it does. Who do you call? What resources do you have? What's the path through, not around? Most people discover, when they actually think this through, that they have significantly more options than panic had been suggesting. The worst case is survivable. Often it's recoverable. Almost always it's less permanently catastrophic than the anxiety was implying. Question 3. What is the actual probability of this worst case? Logic gets to re-enter the room here. When you examine the realistic likelihood of the specific worst case you've named, not the vague general sense of doom, but the actual scenario you identified in question 1, the probability is almost always lower than anxiety was reporting. You're not dismissing the risk. You're correctly sizing it, and correctly sized risks can be planned for. They can be mitigated. They can be accepted as the cost of taking action in an uncertain world, which is the only world that exists. I walked a friend through this process before a high-stakes investor presentation she was losing sleep over. Her worst case: completely freezing, forgetting everything, losing the opportunity. We built a response plan, backup notes, a prepared acknowledgement of nerves that could actually build connection rather than destroy credibility. A list of other investors to contact if this one fell through. The question about probability was the one that landed. Have you ever actually completely frozen? Not gotten nervous, actually frozen, unable to speak? She thought about it. No, not once. She'd been anxious, sometimes visibly, but had always found her way through. The anxiety had been generating a worst case with essentially no historical precedent in her actual life. Once she saw that, the fear didn't disappear, but it became proportional. And proportional fear is just useful information. The thing both tools share. Both the future rehearsal and the worst-case strategy are doing the same fundamental thing. They're asking you to make the implicit explicit. To take what your brain is processing below the surface, the vague dread, the fear of failing, the sense of potential helplessness, and bring it into conscious examination where it can be worked with. Anxiety thrives on abstraction. It needs the threat to remain undefined, because defined threats can be prepared for and undefined ones cannot. The moment you name the worst case precisely and build a plan for it and rehearse your competent response to the realistic challenge, you've removed the primary fuel source. The fear doesn't evaporate, but it loses the quality of vastness that makes it paralyzing. There's a room in your head where the fears live. Anxiety is what happens when you refuse to go in there, when you stand outside it and let your imagination generate increasingly dramatic estimates of what must be inside. You don't have to like what's in there. You just have to turn the light on. Chapter 6. The walls you build before you need them. Emotions are contagious. More contagious in some contexts than most infectious diseases, and considerably harder to quarantine against because nobody thinks to try. You walk into a room where someone is panicking, and your heart rate changes before you've consciously registered that anything is wrong. You sit across from someone who is furious, and your jaw tightens. Your breathing gets shallower. Your body begins preparing for conflict. All before you've decided how you want to respond. Mirror neurons. Limbic resonance. The specific neurological machinery that makes humans capable of empathy is also the machinery that makes other people's emotional states your problem, whether you invited them to be or not. This is not a design flaw. Emotional contagion is what makes humans capable of genuine connection, of reading a room, of responding to the unspoken. It's one of our most valuable features. It also, unmanaged, absolutely destroys your ability to stay composed in the moments that most require it. Because the times your calm matters most, crisis, conflict, high-stakes conversations, someone's meltdown that requires your competent response, are precisely the times when someone else's emotional state is loudest and most aggressively attempting to become yours. The emotional firewall is how you remain genuinely present and genuinely caring while not becoming a passive receiver for every emotional broadcast in the room. Empathy versus absorption. These are not the same thing, and conflating them is one of the more costly mistakes available to a person who actually cares about other people. Empathy means understanding and being moved by what another person is feeling, without losing the thread back to your own state. You comprehend their experience. You care about it. You respond to it. And you remain yourself throughout. Emotional absorption means unconsciously matching the other person's emotional state, taking their anxiety into your body, carrying their anger as your own, becoming overwhelmed by their overwhelm. You're not helping them when this happens. You're just creating two people who are now in crisis instead of one. A crisis counselor told me something that stayed with me. In her first year, she came home emotionally destroyed after every shift. She cared enormously. That was why she'd chosen the work. And caring, for her, had meant fully entering the emotional experience of every person she sat with. She was drowning alongside them, sincerely, which is not actually the same as helping them swim. Her mentor drew the distinction precisely. You can sit with someone in the worst moment of their life. You can care deeply about what they're going through, and you can remain functional, not because you care less, but because a drowning person cannot save another drowning person. She learned to be the shore rather than the water. Building the firewall. The first component is a conscious boundary, established before you enter the situation. 30 seconds before you walk into the interaction where you know emotional intensity will be high. The difficult conversation, the colleague in crisis, the family member who treats emotional escalation as their primary communication style. You spend 30 seconds deliberately establishing your intention to maintain your own state. Some people visualize a boundary around themselves, a membrane, a shield, a container. The specific image doesn't matter. What matters is the intention it encodes. I can be fully present with this person's experience without it becoming my experience. This is not coldness. It is preparation. The surgeon who scrubs in before an operation is not being cold toward the patient. They're ensuring they arrive in the condition required to actually help. The second component is opposite energy matching. When someone in your environment is escalating, volume rising, pace accelerating, emotional temperature climbing, your instinct is to match them. Volume for volume, urgency for urgency. This feels natural because it mirrors their state, and mirroring feels like connection. It isn't. It's amplification. When you deliberately move in the opposite direction, speaking more quietly, moving more deliberately, slowing your speech, you do two things simultaneously. You stay anchored in your own regulated state rather than being pulled into theirs. And you provide something they cannot currently access themselves, which is a model of what regulated looks like. Nervous systems synchronize. When you bring genuine calm into a dysregulated environment, the people in that environment tend to move toward it. Not always, not instantly, but more often than you'd expect. You're not suppressing their emotion. You're providing a reference point. The third component is acknowledge and redirect. When someone is emotionally flooded, the worst thing you can do is argue with the emotion directly. You cannot win a debate about how someone feels. The emotion doesn't care about your counter-arguments. It will simply get louder in response to the resistance. What works is validating the emotional experience while redirecting the interaction towards something actionable. I can see this matters a lot to you. Help me understand what would actually resolve this. You're not agreeing with the behavior. You're not accepting fault that isn't yours. You're acknowledging that their internal experience is real and that you're interested in addressing what's underneath it. This moves the conversation from emotional performance to problem solving, from the expression of the feeling to the source of it. Most people, once they feel genuinely heard, are willing to move there. The asymmetry of the work. Here's what makes the emotional firewall genuinely difficult, and why most people never build it. It requires you to care about someone's emotional state without using that caring as a passive permission slip for their behavior. In relationships, personal, professional, family, we're often taught that caring means absorbing. That if you really love someone, their pain becomes your pain. That if you really understand someone, their anger becomes your anger. That boundaries between your emotional state and theirs indicate a failure of empathy. This is not true, and it produces, in the people who believe it, a particular kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying other people's emotional states as their own for so long, they can no longer reliably locate their own. You can care about someone's fire without setting yourself on fire. In fact, that's the only version of caring that actually helps. The person on fire needs someone who isn't burning, someone who can think, act, and help them find a way out. Your composure in their crisis is not a failure of empathy. It's the most useful thing you can offer. Chapter 7. Your energy is the strategy. Every composure technique in this book has a hidden dependency that nobody mentions in the chapter heading. They all require energy to run. The reset breath requires enough self-awareness to catch the emotion early. The perspective flip requires enough cognitive bandwidth to question your first interpretation. The emotional firewall requires enough internal resource to maintain your own state while engaging with someone else's. None of these are passive. They're active. They draw from something. And if that something is already depleted before the stressful situation arrives, the technique fails. Not because the technique is wrong, because you showed up to a high-performance event running on the functional equivalent of 2 hours of sleep and a grudge. Most people manage their time. Almost nobody manages their energy. They schedule their hours with reasonable care and then wonder why, by 3 o'clock on a Wednesday, every minor frustration feels like a personal attack. They're not fragile. They're empty. The tank hit zero sometime around noon, and nobody noticed, because the calendar still had 4 hours of meetings left. Energy management is not self-care in the soft sense. It's operational infrastructure. It's the foundation that every other technique in this book is built on. And if the foundation isn't there, the building doesn't stand. The energy audit, for 1 week, pay attention to the specific activities and interactions that charge you versus the ones that drain you, not in a vague general sense. Specifically, which meetings leave you feeling genuinely depleted? Which ones don't? Which people, after an hour, leave you with less of yourself than you arrived with? Which tasks exhaust you, not because they're hard, but because they require something you find intrinsically costly? Write it down. The act of writing forces specificity, and specificity is what makes the information actionable. What you're building is a personal energy map, a clear picture of where your composure resources actually go before any stressful situation has even arrived. Most people, when they do this exercise honestly, discover that a significant portion of their depletion is coming from sources they'd never thought to examine. The 15-minute conversation that somehow leaves them tired for an hour afterward. The specific type of decision-making that costs twice what any other kind does. The environmental factors, noise, interruption, information overload, that are running a slow drain in the background all day. You can't manage what you haven't mapped. Strategic scheduling. Once you know your energy pattern, you reorganize around it, not dramatically, not with a complete overhaul of your life, but with deliberate small adjustments that compound. Do the cognitively demanding work during your natural peak. For most people, this is mid-morning, before the accumulated micro-decisions of the day have eroded the prefrontal cortex's available capacity. Schedule the meetings that require your full emotional intelligence after you've had time to arrive, not as the first thing on the calendar. When you have something genuinely draining, a difficult conversation, a high-stakes decision, a challenging interaction you've been putting off, Schedule something restorative immediately after it, even 10 minutes. A walk outside. Silence. A conversation with someone whose company costs you nothing. You're not rewarding yourself. You're refueling before the next draw on the account. Space-draining activities apart. Back-to-back depleting events are not a scheduling inconvenience. They're a guarantee that your composure will be significantly degraded by the second or third one, which is often the one that most requires it. I knew someone who ran a marketing agency and operated for years on what he described as a permanent low-grade emergency. Everything felt urgent. Everything felt like a crisis. He was reactive with his team in ways he wasn't proud of, making decisions he'd revisit with regret. Running at a pace that felt like productivity, but was actually the specific texture of someone who never fully recovered between demands. He didn't change his workload. He changed his relationship to energy. 7 hours of sleep instead of 5. Recovery time after draining meetings, treated as non-negotiable as the meetings themselves. News consumption cut to 15 focused minutes, rather than a continuous ambient stream. 4 mornings a week of physical exercise, not because he needed the health benefits, though they came, but because it was the single intervention that most reliably reset his stress tolerance. Within a month, his team noticed the change before he did. He stopped being the variable they had to calibrate around. He became the steadiest person in the room. Same workload. Different infrastructure. The 3 non-negotiables. There are 3 physical factors that affect your capacity for composure more than almost any psychological technique, and that no amount of mindset work can compensate for when they're absent. Sleep is the most significant and the most commonly rationalized away. Chronic sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired. It degrades emotional regulation specifically, lowering the threshold at which your amygdala triggers, reducing prefrontal cortex activity, making the gap between stimulus and reaction shorter and harder to interrupt. The person who gets 6 hours a night and the person who gets 8 are not experiencing the same stressful event. They're experiencing different events because their brains are processing threat differently at a neurological level. This is not a lifestyle recommendation. It is a performance variable. If you're serious about composure, sleep is not optional infrastructure. Movement, even modest, consistent movement, increases stress tolerance directly. 20 minutes of walking raises the threshold at which your nervous system triggers a stress response. It processes stress hormones already in your system. It increases access to the prefrontal cortex. It's not a metaphor. It's chemistry. Nutrition, specifically the management of blood sugar, affects mood stability in ways most people experience but never connect to the source. The mid-afternoon irritability. The disproportionate response to a small frustration that arrives 2 hours after a missed meal. Your emotional regulation is partly running on glucose, and when that supply gets erratic, so does the regulation. This isn't about dietary purity. It's about not building an emotional composure practice on top of a blood sugar roller coaster. The foundational truth. Every technique in this book is a tool. Tools require a hand capable of holding them. When your energy is depleted, the tools don't disappear, but your access to them degrades. The catch point for the reset breath gets later. The perspective flip feels like too much work. The emotional firewall develops gaps. Everything becomes harder by exactly the degree that your energy has been allowed to run low. Managing your energy is not separate from managing your composure. It is the single most direct investment you can make in it. the one that makes everything else in this book more available, more reliable, more automatic. You've been trying to run a high-performance machine on bad fuel and wondering why it keeps breaking down. The machine isn't the problem. Chapter 8. How to stay calm when someone else is trying to burn it down. Some stress is situational. Some stress is a person, and that person, the one who treats every interaction as a potential conflict, who arrives already at a 7, who seems to interpret calm as provocation, requires a specific set of skills that most composure training completely ignores. It's one thing to stay regulated when the challenge is internal, your own thoughts, your own threat perception, your own history showing up uninvited. It's another thing entirely to maintain composure when someone in the room is actively, loudly, and sometimes skillfully destabilizing the environment around them. This chapter gives you 2 tools, one for the escalating interaction, the raised voice, the aggressive posture, the emotional temperature that keeps climbing despite your best intentions. One for the quieter, often more powerful tool of deliberate silence, which is, it turns out, one of the most underused advantages available in any difficult conversation. The verbal de-escalation method before the technique, the reframe. Because without the reframe, the technique is just a set of moves that feel artificial and often fail. Most aggression, in conversations, in conflict, in the person who comes in hot and gets hotter, is not actually about you. This is extremely difficult to internalize when someone is directing their aggression at you specifically, but it is almost always true. Aggression is fear that ran out of more sophisticated options. It's frustration that has been building longer than this conversation. It's a person who feels unheard, disrespected, or helpless, and whose nervous system has defaulted to its most primitive available response. When you understand this, you stop needing to defend against the aggression. You start addressing the thing underneath it. And the thing underneath it is almost always some version of, I need to feel heard, and I don't believe I'm going to be. 5 steps. Each one counterintuitive enough that you'll need to practice them before they feel natural. Step 1. Lower your voice. When someone raises theirs, every instinct you have says to match the volume or exceed it, to signal that you're not intimidated, that you're serious, that you won't be shouted over. Don't. Loud voices trigger threat responses and escalate conflict. They signal urgency and danger to everyone's nervous system in the room. A quieter voice does something different. It creates a contrast. It forces the other person to slightly adjust, to lean in, to moderate, to listen harder. It sends the signal that this situation, however charged, is manageable. Step 2. Slow your speech. Rapid speech conveys that you're anxious, that the situation is out of control, that urgency is warranted. Deliberate pacing conveys the opposite, that you're present, that you're thinking, that there's no emergency here that requires abandoning careful communication. The pace of your voice is constantly communicating something about the state of the situation. Choose what it says. Step 3. Acknowledge the emotion without accepting the behavior as appropriate. This is the pivotal move, and the one most people get wrong. They either validate everything, taking on fault they don't own, agreeing with characterizations that aren't accurate, or they defend against the emotion directly, arguing with the feeling rather than engaging with what's underneath it. Neither works. The middle path is specific language. I can see this is genuinely frustrating for you. It sounds like this situation has been building for a while. I hear that you're angry, and I want to understand what's actually going on. You're not agreeing. You're not apologizing for things that aren't yours. You're simply acknowledging that the person in front of you is having an experience, which is the thing they most need to feel before they can move toward anything productive. Step 4. Ask questions instead of making statements. Questions engage the prefrontal cortex. Statements, especially defensive ones, engage the amygdala. When you shift from "that's not what happened" to "help me understand what you're most concerned about," you're inviting the other person's rational brain back to the table. You're treating them as someone capable of articulating their actual need, rather than someone to be managed or defeated. Step 5. Find genuine agreement. Not manufactured agreement, not strategic flattery, something you actually agree with. The situation is frustrating. Their concern is understandable. Finding a resolution matters. Small, authentic agreement creates the beginning of shared ground. And shared ground is where de-escalation actually lives. A manager I know runs a retail floor and has used this sequence with genuinely furious customers for years. He told me the results are not 100%. Some people are too far gone to be reached in the moment. But the baseline of how these interactions typically resolve, shifted dramatically once he stopped trying to win the confrontation and started trying to address whatever was actually driving it. Most of the time, what's driving it is simple. Someone felt dismissed. Someone felt disrespected. Someone had a problem and didn't feel like anyone was taking it seriously. The aggression was the escalation, not the cause. Strategic silence. Most people are so uncomfortable with silence that they will fill it with almost anything. Information they hadn't planned to share. Concessions they hadn't intended to make. Qualifications that weaken positions they'd arrived with. Admissions of uncertainty that were being held deliberately in reserve. This is not a character flaw. It's a deeply conditioned social response. Silence in conversation feels like failure, like something has gone wrong, like someone needs to fix it, like whoever speaks first is just doing their job. Learning to be comfortable with silence, genuinely comfortable, not performing comfort while internally panicking, gives you an advantage in almost every high-stakes conversation that is so consistent it borders on unfair. After asking an important question, stay silent. Don't help with the answer. Don't soften the question with follow-up. Let it land and wait. People will fill silence with more truth than they intended to share if you give them long enough. They'll elaborate. They'll clarify. They'll sometimes contradict themselves in ways that reveal what's actually going on. After making an offer or stating a position in a negotiation, stay silent. The person who speaks next is almost always the one who makes the next concession. This applies whether you're negotiating a salary, a contract, a household decision, or where to go for dinner. Whoever is less comfortable with the silence typically gives ground first. When someone says something you disagree with, stay silent initially rather than immediately pushing back. People frequently moderate their own extreme positions when they don't get the resistance they were expecting. They'll walk back the statement, qualify it, or reveal that they didn't entirely mean it. If you simply wait instead of engaging with the provocation. The body language during silence is everything. This is not about being cold or punishing with silence or performing indifference. You maintain calm eye contact. Your posture stays relaxed and open. You convey, through your entire physical presence, that you're not uncomfortable, you're thinking, you're present, you're considering. That distinction, The difference between silence that feels hostile and silence that feels thoughtful is what makes this strategic rather than simply passive-aggressive. And it's entirely communicated through how you hold yourself during the pause. Silence is not agreement. It is not weakness. It is not the absence of a response. It is the sound of someone who doesn't need to win the moment to win the situation. Chapter 9. Performing when it actually counts. Here is something nobody tells you about pressure. It doesn't create weakness. It reveals it. The pressure didn't make you freeze. The pressure found the place where you hadn't built anything yet and showed you exactly where that was. Which is, if you're willing to look at it that way, the most useful information available. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid high-pressure situations. The important presentation, the crucial negotiation, the conversation they've been putting off for 3 months because it's going to require all of them. They mistake avoidance for self-protection, when what they're actually doing is ensuring they arrive at the inevitable moments without any preparation, and then confirming, once again, that pressure is something that happens to them rather than something they can use. This chapter is about the inversion, not how to eliminate pressure. Pressure is just concentrated importance, and you don't actually want to eliminate it, but how to perform better precisely because of it. The people who seem to thrive under high stakes are not experiencing less pressure than you. They've just stopped arguing with the adrenaline. The pressure performance protocol 4 components. They work sequentially, and the sequence matters. The first is a language intervention, which sounds minor and isn't. And most people, entering a high-stakes situation, are running some version of the same internal monologue. This is so much pressure. If I mess this up, it will be terrible. Everyone is watching. I can't afford to get this wrong. Every word of that framing is technically accurate and functionally catastrophic. It activates the threat response. It narrows attention. It tells your nervous system that what you're about to do is dangerous, and your nervous system responds by preparing you for danger, which is not the same as preparing you for performance. The reframe is precise. You're not telling yourself it doesn't matter. You're telling yourself the truth about what pressure actually is. This situation is important, which means it deserves my full attention and best effort. Same stakes, entirely different neurological response. Importance activates engagement. Threat activates protection. You need the former. The second component is the process focus, and this is where most people's performance falls apart under pressure, because pressure makes you obsess about outcomes. Will they like it? Will I get it? Will it work? These are questions about things outside your control, which means every mental cycle you spend on them is borrowed from the limited resource of your actual performance capacity. You cannot think your way to controlling an outcome. You can only execute the process that gives the outcome its best chance. Before a high-stakes situation, write down, literally, physically write, 3 things you can control in the next hour. Your preparation, your pace, your listening, your specific choices about how to open, how to respond to pushback, how to stay present when your attention wants to drift into outcome checking. Focus lives there. Performance lives there. The outcome is downstream of the process. Attend to the process. The third component is the reinterpretation of physical arousal, and this one, once it lands, tends to land hard. When pressure arrives, your heart rate increases, your awareness sharpens, your body temperature rises slightly. Your attention narrows onto what matters. Most people interpret this cluster of sensations as, I'm getting nervous, this is bad, I'm losing control. That interpretation is both optional and counterproductive. Those sensations are your body preparing for peak performance. Increased heart rate sends more oxygenated blood to your brain. Sharpened awareness helps you notice details you'd miss in a lower arousal state. The narrowing of attention is your nervous system helpfully eliminating irrelevant information so you can focus on what's in front of you. You are becoming more capable, not less. The physiological preparation for panic and the physiological preparation for peak performance are nearly identical. The difference is entirely in the label you apply. My body is getting ready. That's it. That's the reframe. Said internally, deliberately, in the moment the sensations arrive. It sounds too simple to matter. It matters enormously. The fourth component is deliberate deceleration. Under pressure, people rush. They speak faster, decide faster, move faster. Partly because urgency feels productive, and partly because the discomfort of high-stakes moments makes people want to get through them as quickly as possible. Rushing degrades quality across the board. It compresses the space between thought and word, between perception and response. It generates exactly the careless mistakes that pressure was supposedly warning you about. Slow down by 10%. Not dramatically, not noticeably to others. Just enough to create a breath between thought and speech, between incoming information and your response to it. That slight deceleration improves decision quality, communication clarity, and the specific quality of presence that makes people trust you in difficult moments. A trial lawyer I know spent her first years in court dreading high-pressure cases. Not because she wasn't prepared, she was meticulous, but because the preparation didn't address what happened when the pressure arrived and her body started doing things she hadn't planned. She'd speed up. She'd lose the thread. She'd feel the gap between who she was in preparation and who she became in performance. She started applying the protocol before every significant trial, reframing the stakes as importance rather than threat, writing down what she could control, reinterpreting the pre-trial physical arousal as preparation rather than warning, consciously slowing her speech by just enough to stay inside her own thinking. The cases didn't get less important. The pressure didn't decrease. Her relationship to both changed entirely. She told me she now prefers high-stakes cases. Not because she's indifferent to outcomes, she cares deeply, but because she's learned that pressure, properly interpreted, sharpens rather than degrades her. She performs better when it matters most. That's not talent. That's a protocol applied consistently until it became instinct. The decision matrix pressure doesn't just affect performance. It degrades decision quality. And in high-stakes situations, decisions are often the performance. The problem is dual. Under pressure, people either overthink and become paralyzed, running infinite loops of consideration that lead nowhere because the real issue isn't information, it's anxiety. Or they act impulsively, letting the urgency of the moment override the careful thinking that the decision actually requires. The decision matrix gives you a structure that's fast enough for real conditions and thorough enough to prevent the specific regrets that pressure-impaired decisions generate. 4 factors, evaluated quickly and honestly. Potential upside. What's the best realistic outcome if this works? Not the fantasy version, the realistic best case. Your brain under pressure filters for downside. This step forces it to also scan for possibility. Potential downside. What's the worst realistic outcome if it doesn't? Realistic, not catastrophic. You're not catastrophizing and you're not minimizing. You're accurately sizing the risk so you can make an informed bet rather than a frightened one. Probability of success, based on what you actually know, your skills, your preparation, the specific conditions. How likely is the positive outcome? You don't need certainty. You need an honest estimate. 40% with high upside and recoverable downside is a very different decision than 40% with low upside and permanent downside consequences. Reversibility. Can you change course if you get new information? Some decisions lock you in. Most don't, and knowing the difference changes how much deliberation the decision actually requires. A reversible decision with manageable downside needs 30 seconds of consideration, not 30 minutes of paralysis. Running these 4 factors takes 2 minutes in real conditions once you've practiced the structure enough times that it's automatic. You're not replacing judgment with a formula. You're ensuring that pressure doesn't collapse your judgment into either paralysis or impulse by giving it a scaffold to work on. The final piece of the decision matrix is a single question to apply to any major decision. Which choice will I be least likely to regret in 10 years? This question functions as a filter for short-term fear. Most of the things that feel frighteningly risky in the present look, from 10 years out, like the obvious choice or the obvious miss. The lens of future regret tends to clarify what your values actually prioritize, separate from what your anxiety is currently amplifying. Decisions made from clarity rather than pressure compound differently over time. The people who perform best when it counts aren't calmer than you. They just stopped arguing with the adrenaline. They built a protocol for what to do with it instead. Chapter 10. The thoughts that are lying to you. Your brain has cognitive biases baked into its architecture, not because something went wrong, because evolution optimized for survival, and survival in an uncertain environment requires a brain that errs aggressively on the side of threat detection. The problem is that threat detection, unexamined, is an absolutely terrible guide to accurate thinking. When you're stressed, your brain runs predictable distortions, systematic errors in interpretation that reliably make situations seem worse, more personal, more permanent, and more catastrophic than they are. These aren't random mistakes. They're patterns. And because they're patterns, they can be identified, named, and interrupted. Most people experience these distortions as simply how things are. The thought feels like a report of reality rather than an interpretation of it. That feeling of certainty is the most important thing to understand about cognitive distortions. It's not evidence that the thought is accurate. It's evidence that the thought is emotionally charged. Those are not the same thing. 5 patterns worth knowing by name. All or nothing thinking frames every situation as existing at one of 2 extremes, with no spectrum between them. You either succeeded completely or failed completely. The relationship is either perfect or irreparably broken. One mistake makes you someone who always makes mistakes. The language markers are absolute. Always, never, completely, total, entire. Reality has almost no situations that actually exist at the extremes. The absolutism is the distortion. Catastrophizing takes a realistic negative outcome and runs it through a filter that transforms it into permanent, total disaster. One critical piece of feedback becomes evidence of inevitable termination. One uncomfortable conversation becomes proof the relationship is unsalvageable. The specific cognitive move is the chain. This happened, which means that will happen, which means eventually this catastrophic conclusion is inevitable. Each link in the chain feels logical. The chain as a whole leads somewhere the evidence doesn't actually support. Mind reading is the confident assumption that you know what other people are thinking, specifically, that they are thinking something negative about you, without any verification. The unreturned message means they're angry. The short reply means they're dismissive. The lack of response to your idea means they think it's bad. These conclusions feel like reasonable inference. They are almost always projection. Personalization takes events that were caused by multiple factors, including factors entirely outside your control, and assigns primary responsibility to you. The team missed the target because you're a bad leader. The event went poorly because of your specific failure. The dynamic in the room is your fault. The distortion is the narrowing of causality onto a single point, you, when reality is always more distributed than that. Filtering attends selectively to the negative while discounting or ignoring the positive. The 45-minute presentation that went well except for one stumbled transition becomes, in memory and retrospect, a presentation defined entirely by the stumble. The performance review that contained 3 genuine commendations and 1 area for development gets processed as critical feedback with some token praise attached. You're not lying to yourself. You're just running a very aggressive editing process. The restructuring sequence. Catching the distortion is the first move. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, you pause and locate the thought generating it. Not the emotion, the thought underneath the emotion. What exactly are you telling yourself about what just happened? Once the thought is visible, you identify which pattern it's running. This step matters more than it sounds. Naming the distortion creates distance from it. You're no longer inside the catastrophizing. You're observing the catastrophizing. That shift in position changes everything about your relationship to the thought. Then you challenge it like a lawyer cross-examining a witness who is technically credible, but actually unreliable. What specific evidence supports this thought? What evidence contradicts it? What would you tell a close friend who came to you thinking this exact thing? What's a more accurate interpretation, not more optimistic, more accurate, based on what you can actually verify? The goal is not a positive thought. The goal is a true thought. Positive thinking that bypasses accuracy is just a different kind of distortion. You're looking for the interpretation that best fits the available evidence, which, in almost every case of cognitive distortion, is considerably less dire than the original thought. Someone I know received critical feedback from her manager, genuinely critical, not softened, and her immediate internal response was a confident, catastrophizing spiral. Termination was coming. Her competence had been definitively exposed as insufficient. Everyone who had ever believed in her had been wrong. She ran the sequence, caught the thought, named the distortion, catastrophizing, and some mind reading about what the feedback meant about her manager's assessment of her future. Challenged it. The evidence. One critical area in a review that also contained genuine positive feedback. An explicit statement from the manager about seeing potential and wanting to support development. No prior performance warnings. No pattern of escalating concern. The restructured thought. I received honest feedback about one area I need to improve. This is what good management looks like. My manager is invested enough in my development to be direct with me. This is useful information, not a verdict. Same feedback, same manager, different thought, different emotional response, different behavior in the aftermath. She went back to her manager with questions rather than defensiveness. The relationship got stronger. The emotional redirect. There is a related skill that addresses a different but adjacent problem. The situation where someone is using emotion not as genuine expression, but as a tool. A lever. A mechanism for producing in you the specific response they want, which is usually compliance, guilt, or capitulation. Genuine emotion deserves empathy. It deserves presence, acknowledgement, the full weight of your attention. Someone expressing real feeling about something that genuinely matters to them should be heard. Emotional manipulation is the performance of emotion in service of control. It is not always conscious. Many people learned early that emotional escalation produces results, and the pattern became automatic long before they were old enough to examine it. But unconscious manipulation is still manipulation, and responding to it with pure empathy is not compassion. It's training. The redirect has a specific structure. You acknowledge the emotional experience without taking ownership of causing it. You don't argue with the feeling. You don't defend against the characterization. You redirect toward the specific, concrete, actionable version of what they actually need. I can hear that you're upset. What specifically would need to be different for this to feel resolved? You maintain your boundary with the same warmth you'd use to acknowledge the feeling. I understand this is disappointing, and my answer is still no. Both clauses present, neither one canceling the other. What you're refusing to do is let the emotional intensity of the performance substitute for a clear communication of an actual need. You care about the person. You're not available to be managed by the performance. The thoughts that are lying to you have been doing it long enough that they feel like your own voice. They use your vocabulary, your specific fears, your particular history, to construct interpretations that feel native and obvious. You've been living inside a story your brain wrote when it was scared. You're allowed to edit it. You're actually required to. Chapter 11. Becoming the person for whom this is just normal. Every technique in this book works at the level of behavior. This chapter works at the level of identity, and identity is where behavior either becomes permanent or keeps reverting. Here's the mechanism. Your actions are not random. They're consistent, not with your intentions, not with your values as you'd articulate them in a reflective moment, but with your identity, with who you believe yourself to be at the level below conscious thought. The self-concept that operates automatically, that generates predictions about how you'll behave before you've decided anything. If your self-concept includes, "I'm someone who gets overwhelmed under pressure," your nervous system will work to confirm that. Not maliciously. It's just how self-concept functions. It runs a confirmation loop. It finds evidence for the identity and discounts evidence against it. It creates behavioral defaults that match the label. This is why most behavior change fails at the technique level. People learn the tool and then use it inconsistently and eventually stop. Not because the tool was wrong, but because using it conflicts with an identity that keeps reasserting itself. You can't sustain behavior that contradicts who you believe you are. The identity wins, eventually, every time. The only durable change is identity-level change, the identity shift. The first move is deceptively simple and genuinely uncomfortable for most people, because it requires making a claim that feels, initially, like a lie. Stop saying I'm trying to be calmer or I'm working on staying composed. Start saying, internally, consistently, and without waiting until it feels true, I'm someone who stays calm under pressure. not as aspiration, as identity statement. Your ego will resist this because it knows the current evidence doesn't fully support it yet. Good. The identity shift doesn't wait for the evidence. It precedes the evidence and then creates it. You're not describing who you've been. You're installing who you're becoming. Because identity, unlike behavior, can be chosen before it's earned. This is not self-deception. Self-deception would be claiming a result without doing the work. You're doing the work. You're also refusing to keep organizing your self-concept around the old patterns while you do it. The second move is evidence collection. Your subconscious mind won't sustain a new identity without proof, so you build the case deliberately and consciously. Every time you choose the calm response, every time you use the reset breath and catch the emotion early, every time you run the perspective flip instead of accepting the first catastrophic interpretation, every time you stay regulated in an environment that's trying to pull you into dysregulation, you acknowledge it explicitly. That's who I am now. That's the person I'm becoming. That's evidence. You're not celebrating. You're filing, building a record that your subconscious can consult when the identity is challenged, which it will be repeatedly, because old patterns are persistent and change is nonlinear. The third move is what I'd call identity anchoring. These are specific moments where you consciously choose the new identity over the old pattern, not because it's easy, but because the choice is the point. Your old identity sends the angry message. Your new identity pauses, breathes, and either doesn't send it or sends the version that actually serves the outcome you want. Your old identity catastrophizes the difficult feedback. Your new identity runs the restructuring sequence. Your old identity matches the room's panic. Your new identity becomes the calm in the room. Each anchoring moment does two things simultaneously. It strengthens the new neural pathway, the one associated with the composed response, and it weakens the old one by not running it. Neural pathways that don't get used weaken. The old pattern doesn't disappear, but its automaticity diminishes every time you choose the alternative. Stress inoculation. The identity shift tells you who you're becoming. Stress inoculation gives you the experiential evidence to support the claim. Here is the uncomfortable truth about composure under pressure. You cannot build it in the absence of pressure. This seems obvious when stated plainly, and is nonetheless something most people resist in practice, because the instinct to avoid discomfort is powerful and patient, and will frame avoidance as wisdom every single time. Comfort zones don't produce resilience. They produce proficiency at being comfortable. Composure, genuine, reliable composure in high-stakes situations, is built through graduated exposure to situations that require it. Not reckless exposure. Not throwing yourself into the deep end without skills. Graduated exposure, systematically, deliberately, incrementally increasing the demands on your composure while you practice your tools inside the challenge. The structure is straightforward. You identify what specifically stresses you. The situations, the interaction types, the performance contexts that reliably challenge your calm. You create a gradient from mildly challenging to genuinely difficult, and you begin moving up that gradient with deliberate regularity, practicing your techniques at each level until that level feels manageable, then moving to the next. If public speaking is your version of this, you don't start with a 1,000-person audience. You start by speaking up more in small meetings, offering the comment you'd normally keep to yourself. Then you volunteer to present an update to your immediate team. Then a slightly larger group. Each level builds something that the next level requires. The specific lived experience of having managed that degree of pressure in your body using your tools. The nervous system learns through experience in a way it cannot learn through understanding. You can comprehend every technique in this book perfectly and still freeze in a high-pressure situation if your nervous system has never practiced its tools under actual pressure. Reading about box breathing is not the same as having used box breathing when your heart rate was elevated and something that mattered was in front of you. The inoculation principle from immunology is precise here. A small, managed exposure to the pathogen builds resistance to larger exposures later. The exposure has to be real. It has to actually activate the stress response. But it has to be manageable enough that you can practice staying functional through it. You're not toughening yourself through suffering. You're building proven capacity through graduated experience. After enough cycles of this, entering the mildly challenging situation, using your tools, managing your state successfully, reflecting on what worked, something changes in how you perceive the challenge. The situation that used to reliably trigger anxiety starts to feel familiar. Not easy, necessarily. Familiar. And familiarity, in your nervous system's language, means not dangerous. The threat response diminishes because the evidence base has shifted. This is the thing about genuine confidence that nobody talks about in the way it actually works. It's not the belief that things will go well. It's the accumulated evidence that you have handled hard things before, that when pressure arrived, you had something to use, and you used it, and you came through. That evidence doesn't lie. It compounds. Every hard situation you navigate with your tools adds to the record. Your nervous system consults the next time pressure arrives. You don't become calm by avoiding chaos. You become calm by going into it enough times that it starts to recognize you. Chapter 12. The calm that changes rooms. At some point, composure stops being personal. The work in the preceding chapters has been building something internal. Architecture, infrastructure, a more reliable version of yourself under pressure. That work matters. And it's not finished, and it never entirely will be. But there's a level beyond personal composure that most books about calm never address, because it requires you to stop thinking about your own state and start thinking about what your state does to the environment around you. Emotions are contagious. We established that in the chapter on the emotional firewall. The way other people's dysregulation can become yours if you haven't built the protection. But the transmission runs both directions. Your regulation can become theirs. The calmest person in a room under pressure is not just managing themselves. They're setting the ceiling on everyone else's anxiety. They're the reference point the room unconsciously uses to calibrate whether the situation is survivable. When that person is visibly overwhelmed, the room tends to follow. When that person stays functional, the room tends to follow that instead. This is not metaphor. Nervous systems synchronize. Mirror neurons do this work below conscious awareness, constantly, in every social environment you've ever been in. You have been influenced this way your entire life. The question is whether you've been influencing others in the direction you actually intend. The Calm Leadership Principle 5 components. Not all of them are about action. Some of them are about what you don't do, which turns out to be equally powerful. The first is the orientation toward solution rather than problem. In crisis, in conflict, in the high-stakes moment where things have gone wrong and everyone in the room is processing that fact loudly and urgently, The most powerful thing you can do is ask a question nobody else is asking yet. What needs to happen next? Not what went wrong, not whose fault it is, not how bad it is, though all of those questions will have their moment. The question that moves the room from reaction to response is always about forward motion. Where do we go from here? What's the next right action? What's available to us right now? This isn't denial of the problem. It's the refusal to let the problem consume all available cognitive resources before the response has been organized. The problem has been identified. The problem is real. Now we are going to address it rather than continue describing it to each other. The second component is asking the question the room forgot to ask. People under pressure lose access to good questions. They narrow. They attend to the most urgent thing at the cost of the most important thing. They accept the first available interpretation and stop checking whether it's accurate. You become the person who gently insists on the better questions. What are we assuming here that might not be true? What are we not considering? What would success actually look like? These questions don't slow things down. They prevent the specific kind of fast movement that covers ground in the wrong direction. The third component is helping people locate what they can control. One of the primary drivers of panic, in individuals and in groups, is the sense of helplessness. The feeling that the situation is happening to you and there's nothing you can influence. That feeling, left alone, escalates. It generates more panic, which narrows thinking further, which makes genuine options harder to see, which confirms the sense of helplessness. You interrupt this by helping people find the boundary between what they can and cannot influence, and directing attention firmly toward the former. We can't change their decision. We can control how prepared we are for either outcome, not as a motivational statement, as a practical redirect of cognitive resources from the uncontrollable to the actionable. The fourth component is making decisions when others are paralyzed. This requires judgment about timing and a certain willingness to be wrong. Not every situation requires someone to unilaterally provide direction. Some situations genuinely need collective deliberation. But there are moments, and in crisis, these moments arrive with regularity, where the most costly thing is continued indecision, where the room needs a path and nobody is offering one. In those moments, you offer it, tentatively if necessary. Here's what I think we should do next. Does anyone see a better option? You're not overriding. You're unlocking. You're giving the paralysis somewhere to go. The fifth component requires nothing active from you at all. It's simply your presence, maintained in a regulated state, while others are not. Nervous systems synchronize downward as readily as they synchronize upward. When the calmest person in the room is genuinely calm, not performing it, not clenching through it, but actually regulated, people in that room tend to become less panicked over time. Not instantly, not completely, but measurably. Your nervous system broadcasts a signal. The signal says, "This situation is survivable. Functional response is possible here." That signal costs you nothing to send. It requires only that you've done enough of the preceding work to actually be regulated when the stakes are high. The preemptive strategy. The calm leadership principle is about what you do when the pressure arrives. The preemptive strategy is about what you do before it does. Specifically, about interrupting your personal stress patterns before they've built enough momentum to override your tools. Everyone has a specific equation. a combination of conditions that reliably produces their worst composure. It's rarely the single difficult thing in isolation. It's almost always the combination. The difficult thing landing on top of depleted energy or time pressure, or a specific type of interaction that has particular charge for you. Spend 2 weeks watching yourself. Not judging, watching. When do you lose your composure most reliably? What time of day? What combinations of factors? Which specific people tend to trigger reactive responses? And what is it about those interactions that bypasses your usual regulation? What are the 2 or 3 conditions that, present simultaneously, reliably compromise you? Once you know your equation, you can design around it. This is not avoidance. You're not eliminating difficult situations from your life. You're eliminating the unnecessary contributors to your worst-case conditions. The variables that aren't load-bearing, but are quietly making everything harder. If you know you lose patience when you're hungry and interrupted simultaneously, you address the hunger because you can. If you know you become defensive when you receive criticism while under deadline pressure, you create a deliberate pause before receiving any feedback during high-pressure periods. If you know you escalate in the evening when you're tired and your kids are loud, you build a transition ritual between work and home that recovers some energy before the evening begins. Buffer time belongs here. Most time-pressure stress is not the result of too little time. It's the result of no margin for the inevitable. Things take longer than planned. Problems arrive unexpectedly. Other people are late. When your schedule has zero slack, every single one of these normal human events becomes a stressor. When you've built margin, left 10 minutes earlier, allocated 40 minutes for the 30-minute task, the inevitable is absorbed rather than destabilizing. Buffer time is not scheduling luxury. It's the physical infrastructure of calm. It's building into your day the acknowledgement that reality does not perform to schedule, and that you would prefer to be prepared for that, rather than perpetually ambushed by it. The preemptive strategy and the calm leadership principle are, at their core, about the same thing. Moving from reactive to intentional. From responding to what the environment produces, to designing the conditions under which your best self is most likely to show up. Leadership isn't title or volume or the confidence of certainty. It's being the person the room reorganizes itself around when things get bad. That person is built in advance. In the small choices, the daily practices, the unglamorous consistency of using your tools when the stakes are low, so they're available when the stakes are not. Conclusion: the calm that compounds. Here is the thing about transformation that nobody warns you about. It doesn't feel like transformation while it's happening. It feels like Tuesday. It feels like remembering to breathe before you respond. It feels like catching the catastrophizing thought 3 seconds earlier than you did last month. It feels like small, unglamorous, unremarkable choices made in ordinary moments, most of which nobody else will ever notice or acknowledge. And then one day, someone who has known you for years says something like, "You seem different lately." And they can't quite name what it is, and you can, but you don't need to explain it, because you know exactly what Tuesday looked like, every Tuesday, for the last 6 months. That's the compound effect. Small inputs, accumulated over time, producing outcomes that look disproportionate to any single moment of effort. You have now spent time with 21 techniques. Some of them already feel like yours. Some will take longer. A few may never quite fit the specific shape of how you're built, and that's correct. The goal was never to master all 21. It was to find your 5, and then use them until they stop being techniques and start being reflexes. Here is what those reflexes eventually produce. In the moments that used to reliably undo you, the criticism that would have sent you into a 3-day spiral, the conflict that would have made you say the thing you'd spend a week trying to undo, the pressure that would have produced your worst decision rather than your best. You'll find something different waiting. Not the absence of feeling, not performed serenity, something sturdier and less dramatic than either of those. The simple, reliable capacity to think clearly when clarity is most required. That capacity compounds in every direction simultaneously. The quality of your decisions improves, and better decisions produce better circumstances, and better circumstances reduce baseline stress, which makes composure easier to maintain, which improves decisions further. The relationships that required you to be at your worst to navigate them start requiring less of you. The opportunities that used to pass you by, because you were too reactive to see them clearly, or too overwhelmed to act, become visible again. None of this is magic. All of it is downstream of the same thing: the ability to create a gap between what happens and how you respond, and to fill that gap with something better than your oldest, most frightened pattern. I want to leave you with the honest version of what this work actually asks of you. It asks for inconsistency without surrender. You will use the tools and then forget to use them. You will have a week where everything works, and then a single bad afternoon that makes you feel like you've gone backward. You will catch the emotion early on Monday and completely miss it on Thursday. This is not failure. This is what learning a physical skill looks like. Not a clean upward line, but a messy, non-linear accumulation that averages in the right direction over time. The only version of this that doesn't work is the one where you stop. You are not here to manage your reactions for the rest of your life. That's the beginning. The training wheels version, the necessary starting place. You're here to become the kind of person calm comes naturally to. The person who doesn't need to remember the technique, because the technique has become the default. The person for whom composure is not an achievement in the moment, but a baseline from which moments are navigated. That person is built Tuesday by Tuesday, breath by breath, small choice compounding into character. You already started.